Hi, and welcome to the Men on the Path to Love podcast. Bonus episode, How to Become the Complete Man. I'm Bill Simpson, your host. I coach men who are struggling in relationship, how to communicate effectively, build trust, and deepen intimacy so they can be the best version of themselves in relationship and live the life they love. In this bonus episode, you will hear my conversation with award-winning author Purdeep Sangha. He wrote the book, The Complete Man. He is also a strategist for businessmen and the host of the TV show for entrepreneurs called Mind Your Own Business. We talk about what it means to be a complete man. You'll hear Purdeep's story and his take on masculinity and much more. So stay with me. It's the Men on the Path to Love podcast. Welcome, Purdeep, to Men on the Path to Love.
Hey, thanks, Bill. Appreciate you having me.
I'm really excited to be able to talk with you today. I want to get into what it means to be a complete man. But first, I'll tell stories on my show, on my podcast. It's all about telling stories. So I'd like to start off hearing your story of your journey and how you got to be where you are today. I know that
Wow,
could
sure.
take a long time.
Yeah, so hopefully I don't drag it on too long. But I grew up, so I'm in Canada. I grew up in a small town. It's a little bit of a bigger city now called Kelowna, British Columbia. And my parents were immigrants. They immigrated over in the 70s, early 70s, and then had my brother and and pretty much I could say our entire childhood was on an orchard.
Mm,
So when my parents immigrated over from India, they didn't have any technical skill really. They weren't educated, and all they knew how to do was really work hard. And
mhm.
so they started working on an orchard and then eventually saved up enough money and bought their own orchard and then started the family business. But that was a really interesting time for me because that upbringing, being on an orchard, it in that place, because it's phenomenal. I call it the Canadian version of the Napa Valley. Just beautiful
Oh,
hills, mountains, water skiing in the summer,
yeah.
skiing in the winter, just a complete paradise for Canada. And just an amazing place to grow up, tons of orchards, vineyards, but a very mindful environment.
Mm,
So I spent a lot of time with nature. A lot of the days I actually just spent by myself with no one around, just me, the animals, the birds, the gophers.
hmm
And so I think that gave me an interesting or unique take on life because I was just so connected to nature from that perspective. It's completely different than how kids are being raised today with screens and everything.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, so it's night and day. But on top of that, my parents had, you can say, having an Indian background, we had traditional gender roles.
Right.
My mom worked as well, though, so it wasn't that she would stay at home. She worked just as hard as my dad, but she did the typical thing that women do. And then my dad did the typical things that men do. And my dad was a very interesting person because we're talking about men on the path to love. My journey really started, I would say, it was triggered by my dad because my dad was a very interesting person. He was a very masculine man, big in stature, big in nature. If you walked into the room, you didn't even have to see him, you could just sense his presence.
Yeah.
And so he had that energy about him. The challenge with him was that, and I shared in my book, is that he struggled with alcoholism.
Mm,
And he was a great dad when he was sober. He was always someone I could rely on. But then when he drank, typically he would drink a little bit too much and he turned into a completely different person, a completely
mm,
different man. And
mm.
he was scary because he had some unresolved challenges and issues. And if something set him off, it was like a bomb went off. And so as a young boy, 8 years old, if that happened, it just freaked me out. But
Sure.
I learned at a very early age how to calm my dad down. I was the only person in the house that actually calm him down. So I became the mediator. I started to study his behavior.
You were kind of the parentifier, it looks like.
Yeah, yeah. It was an interesting dichotomy because I loved my dad, but I also had this level of hate because
Sure.
if he was a bad dad, it'd be one thing. But he was a great dad from that perspective. He just
Right.
had a challenge he couldn't get past. And I knew he wanted to get past it. He tried several times. He just didn't have the tools and you can say that the ability to do so. But I learned the psychology of men at that time and the psychology of men and the dynamic between men and women, particularly studying my parents
hmm
and the traditional gender roles, for example. And on top of that, my grandfather immigrated over to Canada as well, my grandfather, grandmother. And my
Mhm.
grandfather had a huge impact and influence on me too. He was in the Indian Army for 30 plus years, a very strong man. I say they don't make men like they used to because he was that type of person, very disciplined, but also taught me about philosophy, taught me
Mhm.
about values and principles, a lot of the stuff we don't talk about as men these days. And with our boys, I mean, in particular.
Right.
And I learned that at a very young age. But his dad, so my great grandfather was a spiritual teacher in India for 60 plus years.
Mm.
And so my grandfather was a very spiritual man, taught me mindfulness, meditation. And so why I share this is because I grew up in this very interesting dynamic of men who were very strong, but also challenged as well.
Right.
The discipline side of it. But my dad was a very emotional man. He's probably the most emotional man I know because he was very statured, very
Hmm.
masculine, but he had a very emotional side. No one could question his masculinity, but he was completely open with his emotions. And so that taught me something really interesting. And so fast forward, I went down the academic path, and my background's also in neuroscience and performance psychology as well as business. So I was very much about, you can say, the spiritual realm plus the science and performance and men. And then fast forward today's age or era, where I am today is working with men in a lot of different capacities. We work primarily with men who are business leaders, CEOs, executives, business owners, managers, who are really looking to step up their personal performance and leadership as in business, but also as a husband and as a father. And we do work with women as well, but we have a specific niche. There's some additional background around that as well because I created a research institution around performance and the psychology and the science behind it. But my mission in everyday life, I am on calls, meetings, leading workshops, training for men, helping them really succeed in their business and in their personal lives.
Wow. And you've got quite a background, and it sounds like all the influences that you had created that, that quote unquote complete man for you, not just that one image of masculinity, what it meant to be a man, but you incorporated a lot of different things, which is all about being complete.
Yeah, for me it was a journey, and I would say I couldn't stop doing what I was doing even if I tried.
Right.
And I think because of my background in science, I'm very much an experimenter. So I take the spiritual aspect into play, but I also take a look at the real hard facts, right?
Hmm.
And what's actually happening and the practicality of things. And so that all came together where we created a very specific niche in being able to help men because men are interesting.
Yeah.
There's definitely the spiritual side, and I think a lot of men understand that and get that. But when trying to get people to shift, particularly men, shift their behavior, it's a lot easier to talk about the science
Yeah.
because that goes much further. So they don't question it as much. Even if they do question it, we have the science to show and back it. Then they're like, okay, that makes sense. Let me
Yeah.
do that. Let me do things differently.
You have the proof and they want to see the proof. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The facts and the figures and the proof. Yep.
Yeah. And so part of what I'm hearing you saying, Pradeep, is not just completion, but it's balance. It's a sense of balance.
Yeah, it's completion, but it's also so the interesting part here is the whole thought of the complete man is a continuous journey. That's
Mm.
what it is. It's never ending. It's never the interesting part, the irony of is you're never complete.
Right.
And but it starts from within. It's something that my grandfather taught me. It's part of our heritage and religious background. But I'm not very religious. He taught me more around the philosophy of it.
Mm.
But Sikhism is the religion, and that's in an area of Punjab in India. And you'll see people wearing turbans typically.
Right.
And the whole word Sikh means to learn, to be a disciple of. And so that's the whole purpose of life is to continuously learn and continuously grow as an individual internally. So that's a core part of the teaching of the complete man is it's a constant journey and focusing on the inside rather than the external circumstances. And that's how we get men to really step up their performance because they're not influenced as much by the external factors when it comes to the work that we do. But the complete man is a compilation of all my learnings and our scientific research and our psychological research and experience because we've worked with hundreds of men, done research with thousands of men
Mm.
to really bring home what actually works and in a lot of cases doesn't work for men.
So where do you see are the main issues that men come to you for?
This is the interesting part because I started with business. So that was the first, you can say, doorway that I opened when I left the corporate world. I'm an entrepreneur by trade, so we have businesses in different sectors, but I also wanted to help other entrepreneurs.
Hmm.
And I wanted to focus on business. I did not honestly want to focus on the personal side because I didn't want to go into the realm of life coaching or that type of stereotype.
Right.
But doors just kept opening. Every time we would have a conversation with men about growing their business, 75% of the conversation would go over towards their personal lives and their
Wow.
personal performance.
Hmm.
And so it took me a while, but I finally said, okay, I get the point. Because that was something that I focused on at a very early on, and I can share that a little bit later. But now, when we were helping men on the personal side, their business performance started to go up significantly faster.
Wow.
So most men, in all honesty, come to us because they want to grow their business or they want to excel in their career or they just want to make more money.
Hmm.
That's, I would say, about 85 to 90% of men come to us for that. What happens after the scenes is we start working on all the other stuff. So having that direct message of, hey, perhaps you want to take a look at your personal performance or your fulfillment or your relationship, all that kind of stuff, doesn't work as well with men unless
Right.
things are completely falling apart. And even when they are falling apart, here's what I've seen the pattern with men is they will come and they say they will need help with this particular area, for example, their relationship. And they only come when it's going bad,
Like a crisis.
right?
Yep.
Yeah, a crisis.
Yep.
And what ends up happening though is when that crisis becomes bearable, meaning that it's okay again at a somewhat of a satisfactory level, they will bail.
Right.
And
I
and
found
then
that
what
in
ends
my
up
own experience as a relationship coach. Yes. They get to that certain level, then they think, okay, I'm done. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so what ends up happening is they go into that either the pendulum or the ups and downs
Hmm.
of that pattern and behavior and they continue on. And we learned this the hard way at the beginning is men came in, worked with us for a certain period of time, would drop out. We'd be like, what's going on here? It's because perhaps they stopped fighting with their wife,
Hmm.
either because they changed things a little bit or the wife changed things slightly. And then things would get better for a couple of months, but then things would get worse again and they come back. And so we found men can be very interesting that from that perspective is they try to do things alone many of the times.
Right.
And that can end up biting them in the butt. Well, I guess quite often.
Yeah. When you were talking about them, men coming to you for the business piece and kind of covering that first before they get into the personal stuff, I had a guess that she's an image and dating coach for men, especially in midlife. And it's very similar. It started out just getting his style right and getting the external. So she would work from the outside and then go in. And I hear you kind of saying the same thing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because most men will not open up unless we have created that environment to be
Right.
able to have not just a safe environment, but where they realize that all these personal factors impact them in all areas of life. So, what your previous question about balance, we talk about balance, but we also talk about harmony. That harmony is so critical, and that's where guys I think are challenged the most. Is they're aiming for balance, but they're not necessarily getting the harmony that they're looking for.
Yeah, I say that a lot I'm a mind body educator and integrative therapy practitioner at a health clinic. And my approach to wellness is body, mind, emotion, and spirit. And when those are working in harmony versus balance, that even if things aren't going our way, we're still living a pretty vital life. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That whole alignment piece is very powerful from an
Yeah.
energetic perspective.
So take us through the process. If a man, wanted to come to you, I know you touched on it a little bit, but a little bit more specific about the process that he would go through.
It really depends on the avenue because we have very specific type of programs. So some men come in and they have a challenge with their relationship.
Hmm.
So then we will see if we are equipped, for example, and our methodology is to help them be better leaders as a husband, a
Gotcha.
better leader as a husband, not necessarily fix their relationship problems. We have people on our extended team who are therapists,
Hmm.
relationship therapists, that they perhaps do need to sit down and go deeper, or maybe there's some trauma that's involved. But we talk about how to show up with strength and power and understand where they are actually empowered in life rather than disempowered.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, I'll give you a prime example in terms of, for example, what is their identity and the
Hmm.
difference between identity, who they are at a soul level, and where the ego comes in as well. So
Right.
just by explaining, and at most, I would say a lot of men are not in touch with their soul.
Hmm.
And so what ends up happening, I'll give you a prime example. One of the first examples are exercises we get men to do is we will either facilitate a session or get them to go away where they are gone for a minimum of one night, ideally 2 to 3 nights, where we have a whole process identified where they identify what their vision is for their life.
Hmm.
But part of that exercise is also peeling back the layers of saying, if I had no responsibilities and my roles were not this, what would I want my life to be like? And I'll be more clear on this. If I
Hmm.
was not a husband, or taking that part away, if I was not a father, taking that part away, or my responsibilities as a father and husband, and then identifying who you are at the true core. And this can take a while for some men because it's not always evident because who we are as individuals, as you know, is uh, layers of social pressure, for example, or layers of our role, layers of our past experiences, all these different things. And then we come up with who we believe we are. And if you ask many men from our experience, who are you at the true core? It's hard for them to express that because it comes down to the roles that they have rather than who they are.
Yeah, we're so conditioned to it's my profession, that's who I am, or I am a husband. Yeah, we're so conditioned to do that.
And so by taking them through this exercise, it's unwinding and taking away all those different layers. Those layers are there, they need to be there, but they come on after once you have clarity around what you truly want in life. And so by saying, what do I truly want from my life without any social pressures or even self pressures that I put on myself based on my roles and responsibilities? What do I want? By getting in touch with that, then we are able to create more alignment by saying, okay, so how does being a father fit in with that? How does being a husband fit in with that? How does being a CEO fit in with that? And then creating that greater clarity from the vision. And then we also take a look at from the vision, we create very clear goals
Hmm.
because our brain is a goal driven organ. And a lot of us talk about having goals, but a lot of us don't understand how to write effective goals
Hmm.
because there's key aspects of goal setting that are actually very critical to be able to create more energy, drive, motivation, what we call inspiration, to be able to achieve those goals. And so we take them through that process. We are very, I would say, goal focused and performance focused. Two reasons why, because we find goal focus works very well. There's a scientific backing behind that,
Sure.
but also performance, because when you talk about performance with men, they can get behind that,
Hmm.
right? They can get behind, I want to perform better as a business leader. I want to perform better as a husband. I want to perform better as a father
Yeah.
because there's an element of action
Hmm.
and growth. And so that's where we come in is we're very much a performance driven organization, but we are a lot about fulfillment as well. So performance and fulfillment.
Yeah, that's a great approach. And part of what I'm hearing you say, Pradeep, is when you peel away those other layers of their roles, that you're really kind of honing in on their values, like what's really important, what matters to them, right?
Oh, there's a whole bunch of layers. There's their identity,
Hmm.
there's their values, there's their belief systems, there's the
All of it.
stories that they tell themselves,
Yeah.
their personality traits, their character. So we basically take a look at all those layers, and actually by making them aware of those layers is very powerful to help
Mhm.
them identify. I'll give you another example.
Sure.
We tend to give people a pass, whether that's other people or even ourselves, because we believe that's our personality or personality traits, right?
Hmm.
And not differentiating. There's a difference between personality traits, someone's perhaps innate behavior, and their character. And by saying there is a conscious and controllable way of actually behaving based on character, you can actually override your personality traits. And people need to, I think, particularly men need to understand that because it's extremely powerful. We've worked with a lot of men that have come out of rehab, for example, because in rehab, it's great, but it's hard to go back to regular life after rehab. Like, how do you actually go back to regular life and live like that? And
Yeah.
so we end up actually not doing the rehab part, but how do you get back into life and feel good and perform better and deal with all those situations when, especially when you're going back into the same environment? But one of the key things that we found worked out very well is getting them to understand that you don't have to behave this way because a lot of people think that they're stuck in a certain behavior. That's who I am, or that's how is
Mhm.
my genetic predisposition. So awareness has a big part to play in this, and getting them to understand those different things. What is a belief? What is a story? What is your identity? What is ego? And when they can understand these different aspects, it's easier for them to put it all in place. When they start to behave a certain way, they can say, "Oh, that's my ego," or "That's my identity,"
Right.
or "That's my character trait," or maybe I'm making a decision based on my value. So it's educating them and getting them to understand these different layers of being a human being.
Yeah, and I think of as a coach, and I explain this to my clients, that the way the brain works, we may have all this theory and we may know all this stuff or think we know it, yet we have to practice it. And so they go out and they do it for a little bit and then they take a step back and they're like, well, see, all this stuff doesn't work. This is not who I am, blah, blah, blah. And they give up. And I'm like, no, it's just a step back and you can take another step forward. But so many times they're just, if they take that step back, they think it doesn't work and then they're done.
The way to
You,
go, yeah.
yeah.
And I think that's why inner reflection and awareness is so important.
Hmm.
Because
Absolutely.
when it becomes an exercise of inner reflection and awareness, there's always an element of growth. Always.
Always.
Um, I can't like I can't share enough where almost every hour I have an aha moment. Like there's like, okay, that's what I did. That's my behavior. Okay, I understand why. Or I could have done that differently. And it becomes fun. It becomes a game. It's no longer about, oh, I made a mistake. It's about what did I learn as a result of that.
Yeah, and I see a lot of freedom in that, liberation in that you're not being so hard on yourself for every little thing. It's just opening up to another growth moment or whatever, right?
Yeah, and men, as you know, can be tough on themselves.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And I think all human beings are like this. We're tougher on ourselves than anybody else, but
sure.
particularly us men, because we have that inside of us. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's a pros to the masculine energy, but there's also, when you push yourself past in terms of overextending that energy, there's also a dark side to that as well. And that can be one of it, being overly critical.
Yeah, and I did a whole episode on self-compassion, and that's big. And I really didn't. I mean, I kind of knew about it. Yeah, I hear you. Self-compassion, whatever. But I really dug deep and did some work around it, and it absolutely changed my whole perspective of myself and how I was in the world. And we just don't have people to role model that for us. And we have to learn it. And it's not easy. It's hard not to be hard on yourself. And I still find myself, catching myself being hard on myself after 9 years of learning about this. And so it is a process and it takes time.
Yeah, what you just talked about, self-compassion is so, again, so important. Compassion is one of those things that's, from my perspective, it's the next layer of empathy. And
Hmm.
so I don't think, have empathy enough for other people and compassion for enough for other people, and definitely for ourselves. I think this all, along with compassion, self-compassion, there's self-love,
Right.
and that part think is severely missing for men because the vast majority of men, from our experience in our circle, are men that will put their lives on the line for their family members. They're doing everything for their family members,
Hmm.
and a lot of them don't do enough for themselves. And so they've been taught you got to suffer, you got to struggle, you got to put up with things. But there's a difference between putting up with something and loving yourself.
Hmm.
Because I see a lot of men tolerating behavior, so self-sabotage behavior, or even behavior from people that they're accepting from other people. It could be from their spouse, it could be
Right.
from their kids, or whatever that is. Especially in today's age, we are training men to take on a lot of, I'm going to say, unnecessary, I don't want to use the word abuse, but behavior from other people just because we're men and we're supposed to be able to put up with it. Right.
Right.
And
Right.
there's a lot of men bashing happening right now, a lot of masculinity bashing.
Yeah.
And that's not appropriate. And I think that's the other biggest challenge right now, Bill, that's happening in society. And there's more awareness around this now. This whole thing about masculinity is bad, toxic masculinity, all this whole thing that's been happening, particularly in the last 5 years. And I think a lot of people caught onto it now. There's a lot of women now saying, okay, enough is enough.
Mm.
But we are teaching the next generation that it's not okay to be masculine. And that's why I would say even my generation, so I'm in my 40s, and I tell my peers, I tell all my guy buddies, I tell all the men that I work with, because I'm seeing a big difference, even in men in the 30s, that we are like the last line of defense right now for masculinity.
Yeah.
because the kids that are younger, my son is 10 years old, they are not being taught outside of the home that masculinity is a good thing. They're being taught the complete opposite. And so we have a lot of work to do as mentors and as men, as fathers, especially with this next generation.
Yeah, and I've talked a lot about toxic masculinity. We've gotten a bum rap over a lot of the masculinity stuff, and it's really embracing our masculinity and not giving it up in order to fit some sort of mold. Um, and I had a guest that was saying, back in the 80s, and this was more my generation, there was a men's movement and there was positivity around the toxic masculinity in a way that was uplifting for men that really didn't take off. And it wasn't until like the Me Too movement that this surfaced as this bad thing that men are bad and we started getting bashed. So, there's still a long way to go to kind of balance that out as well.
Oh, definitely. I'm not saying that men are off the hook in terms of the
No, no.
way that we've behaved. I have this concept or terminology that we work with men on. It's called being the mindful alpha male
Hmm.
because it is very important. And I've seen it work. I've seen it work with men when I grew up with. So the alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet, which is basically the beginning and the origin. And I'm a firm believer that every man should be the creator of his or his destiny. Definitely.
Sure.
And so we're either a creator or we're a follower. That's basically how life works. And it's important because for our families need leaders. They need a leader. Our children are looking towards that. Even women are looking towards their husbands to take leadership. And that's very, very important. And if we don't take leadership and we don't create our destinies, then we're stuck with the circumstances that are given to us. So being an alpha male has been completely misconstrued by society. And part of that is also men who are alpha males, but they're not mindful.
Right. That's the other
That
part.
is the other aspect.
Yeah.
And the mindfulness part is the balancing of the alpha male side, which is it comes from again from where I've gathered this is from the Buddhist principles of they talk about how when making a decision, think of as if whatever decision you're going to make, whatever action you're going to take, is going to have a ripple effect throughout the universe and potentially for generations to come.
Mm, yeah.
But also take it lightheartedly and be somewhat comical with yourself. That's actually going to have an impact. So basically, be aware and mindful of everything, but don't take it so seriously.
Right. I was gonna say, don't take yourself so seriously with it all.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that part. And that's something that my grandfather taught me because my grandfather, I would say, was in that blend between Marcus Aurelius and someone like the Dalai Lama, right? So
Mhm.
it was kind of an in between of both worlds. He came from a world of war, but was also a very spiritual man. And so I learned that. And that's kind of the core because I used to see how he would behave, how he would interact, his level of respect that he would get from the community. He was never bothered by anything. And his sheer commitment to, in terms of his meditation and practices from that perspective and being a good man was, I would say, an impetus of where I started to grow this concept of the complete man and the mindful alpha man.
And it sounds like he had quite an impact on you.
Oh, phenomenal impact. I would say that probably the biggest outside of my dad. My dad, my grandfather were the biggest figures, I think, in a lot of men's cases or boys' cases, impact in my life, both on the positive side, but also on the learning side. Had my dad not had the challenges that he had, I wouldn't have the skills that I have.
Right. You wouldn't have that awareness either.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, Pradeep, I mean, I feel like you and I could talk all day. I just want to check in with you to see if there's anything else you'd like to share before we wrap things up.
Well, I think for men out there, I think it's great to continue to be aligned with yourself. I think that's the one thing that you need to do better at. And what I mean by that is what is our natural nature? Like who are we on the inside? And I think when men get to that point where we are able to find that alignment, that harmony, it's like a switch just turns on. Things become that much easier. We have that much more energy. We have that much more fulfillment and happiness and joy in our life. The trick is to find that alignment part and
Absolutely.
that's a search in itself.
Yeah, it's a process too, right? Yeah, it
Yes.
takes time. Well, Pradeep, thank you so much for reaching out and being a guest on Men on the Path to Love. If someone were to want to get in touch with you or your organization, I mean, you guys are doing great things. It's just amazing. How would they go about doing that?
There's two ways. Simply, if you go to purdeepsangha.com on the website, there's a contact form, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn.
And I'll have that contact information in my show notes. All right, Pradeep, thank you so much.
Yeah,
I really appreciate what you're doing. You're doing some great stuff. I wish you continued success in all that you're doing.
thanks, Bill. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And that will do it for another episode of the Men on the Path to Love podcast. Bonus episode, How to Become a Complete Man with author Purdeep Sangha. I'm Bill Simpson, your host. Thank you for listening. And thanks again to Purdeep Sangha for sharing his thoughts and wisdom with us. You'll find Purdeep's website and LinkedIn information in the show notes. Now, coming up on the next episode of the Men on the Path to Love podcast, I'll be talking about a concept called content versus process. In a nutshell, content is what you're saying. In a nutshell, content is what you're saying, and the process is how you're saying it. Fully understanding this can be a game changer in your relationship. Please join me as I give you the what and how of it all. Plus, you'll hear Sam's story about how he came to understand it and where it saved his marriage. Please join me for the content versus process. It's not just what you say, it's how you say it episode. So, is there something on your mind you'd like from... So I want to ask you, is there something on your mind... So I have a question for you. Is there something on your mind you'd like for me to cover on this podcast? Or perhaps there is something going on in your relationship you need help with? Well, you can let me know by going to my website, menonthepathtolove.com. You can email me or set up a free call. And while you're there, you can also download my free cheat sheet, 5 ways to communicate better in relationship. That's at menonthepathtolove.com. And if you know someone you think might get something out of listening to this podcast or would like to post it on your social media, please share the link and share the love. And until next time, keep your heart open and stay on the path to love.